If you're not going to watch the entire video, here's a summary. Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn is the perfect 7 out of 10 game to play on Xbox Game Pass. The story is forgettable and exists only to lead you from one boss fight to the next. The gameplay loop is a bit of an interesting mix between melee and ranged combat, which you may or may not like. Everything else about the game is really average, but since it is quite short, you might consider investing some time in this if you don't have anything else to play at the moment. Now on to the full review.
Touch that skull for me.
All right.
More in. Careful from flying.
What was that?
It's called a rift. On to the next one.
This was originally going to be an early impressions video for Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn, similar to videos I've done for The First Descendant and Zenless Zone Zero earlier this month. I only made early impressions videos for those two previous games because I wasn't too interested to finish them. But halfway through my playthrough of Flintlock, I realized that I was actually interested to finish the game. And that's what I did. It helped that the game is quite short and I was able to finish it in a little over 7 hours. And these days, if I'm able to finish a game, I consider it to be at least a decent game. That's what Flintlock is. A really decent game which has a few moments of fun but is wrapped in such a mediocre package that the 7 out of 10 scores that it is getting seem justified. Before we get into the details, here's a warning that this review will include some spoilers from the game, and while I don't show any footage from the later stages of the game, I do talk a little about the final boss without going into too many details. With that said, let's dive in. Usually I begin my reviews with the story, but I thought it would be nice to switch up the order. So let's talk about the gameplay first. Flintlock is a Souls light action game, which means it isn't as punishing as hardcore Souls games like Elden Ring or Sekiro, but it does place a lot of emphasis on combat, and there are a few minor features that it borrows from the Souls formula too. For example, you can rest at a camp or lodestone to replenish your health and healing potions, but this also respawns all enemies in the area. The other similarity is the game's emphasis on boss fights to move the game forward. You start off slow, getting used to the combat and traversal, but after that, each mission is essentially a path to the next main boss fight, of which there are just 4. This may seem like a small number, and it is, but the larger problem is that you can simply brute force your way to victory over all the bosses. Each boss does have their own attack patterns, but you can sidestep all of those and win easily due to the way the game's combat mechanics work, which we'll get to in a minute. The key difference between this and hardcore Souls games is a difficulty setting. The game is easy as it is, but you can make it even simpler if you want by selecting the easy mode, which disables trophies and achievements. This setting alone can make the genre more inviting to a new audience who may have been intimidated by the difficulty of Souls games. Now let's talk a bit about the combat. Flintlock offers a mixture of melee and ranged combat, and you are required to use both of them in order to efficiently beat the game. As you may be aware, most enemies in Souls games feature 2 kinds of attacks. Those which you can block and those which you cannot block. Usually you would just dodge or roll away from unblockable attacks. In this game, you can cancel such attacks by shooting your ranged weapon as soon as you see a red indicator, which stuns the enemy, including bosses. However, you get very limited ammo for your ranged weapons, and the only way to get more ammo is by performing melee attacks on an enemy. This offers an interesting loop where you keep switching between melee and ranged attacks, but I can see how some people may not really like this system in the beginning. And it is this system combined with the easy difficulty which makes all the bosses quite easy to beat. The 4 bosses all have their own unique attack patterns. For example, the first boss has multiple arms, so you need to parry them 3 times for it to count as a single parry. You are supposed to do this multiple times to break their shield. But you can skip all this by simply spamming regular attacks that recharge your ranged ammo, and when they try to use their special moves, which can be identified by a red indicator, you simply stun them and continue spamming your primary attack. Rinse and repeat till the fight is done. The final boss does make things a bit challenging because he's a winged boss who you actually meet at the start of the game. I won't spoil the final fight, but this part can be a bit annoying because you're on the ground and the boss can spam aerial attacks, which can take a minute to get used to. After that, you can use the same routine of spamming primary attacks and stun attacks to beat the final boss as well. This glaring loophole aside, I actually had a good time with the gameplay. It did feel a bit slow compared to other games, but occasionally there's nothing wrong in slowing down and putting some thought into every move. Plus, there's always the option to use the loophole and spam attacks to make things go faster. Now let's move on to other aspects of the gameplay. The traversal system shown in trailers might have attracted quite a few people. This is where you kind of turn into a fox and fly through the map. The fox is called Enki, and he is a god who helps you on your travels. The flying part is this game's version of the grapple hook, and I was happy to see this unique spin on the idea. Similar to the grapple hook concept, there are limited points in the world where you can zip through the air from one point to another, which sometimes saves you time and sometimes is actually necessary to reach heights and distances which would otherwise be impossible on foot. Enki has other uses too. He can stun minor enemies, suspend them in mid-air, and also help you perform powerful energy attacks that are great for crowd control. As expected, there is a skill tree which you can level up as you go along, as well as a loot system where you get different sorts of melee and ranged weapons and upgrade them using materials you find across the world. I did not really engage in this system much at all. In fact, I finished the game using the starter weapons I got, and I think I upgraded them only once as part of the tutorial. As for the skill tree, I did level up some of them because I was racking up the currency required to buy these points and had to spend it somewhere. This currency is called reputation, and if you die, you drop all of that reputation at the place you died, and you then have to go pick it up manually. Not an entirely new idea, but you don't have to deal with it much if you are careful enough to just not die. Speaking of the game's world, this is a semi-open world with multiple maps. Each map has its own set of side quests and fast travel points to unlock. You can travel between the maps at any time as long as the main story doesn't block you from doing so. However, once the game is complete, I wasn't given an option to go back and finish any unfinished stuff. All I could do was load up an old save before the final boss. This is partly due to what happens at the end of the story, but partly also because this is not a true open world game. It is linear for the most part, and you are expected to keep moving forward as the story goes on. But there are some aspects of open world game design that you can find here, like fast travel points and the freedom to set active quests to choose to either pursue the main quest or go and do some side quests. There's also an obligatory mini game called Sebo, which is kind of like tic-tac-toe, but you have to form a triangle instead of a line while preventing your opponent from doing the same. And you also have a fixed number of moves per round. It was okay the first time I played it, but I don't think we are going to see another breakout hit like Gwent from The Witcher 3. There's an outpost feature that feels directly ripped from open world games like Far Cry and Assassin's Creed. You defeat all the enemies in the area and then fight against the boss. Once you take them down, the outpost is yours. Not a revolutionary concept, but it gives you something else to do in the game. And sometimes it is actually part of the story to take down an outpost. Speaking of which, let's now talk about the story.
No. For 10 bitter years since the dead broke through the door, I've promised you peace. Today, I'm making good on it. Sama hatched a plan to blow up the door, to cut the dead off forever. Halin and I volunteered. We
You play as Nor, a soldier stuck in a magical war between mortals and gods. Unlike most other fantasy games, the gods in this game are the bad guys, and it's not immediately clear why. All you are told in the beginning is that you are at war with the gods, and that's it. And to be honest, I didn't really learn much about the reason behind this by the end of the game either. That's probably because I was never really invested in the story. The main problem is the game's tone. It is quite dark and serious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for such a style to work, the story needs to be really interesting. And it's quite hard to write an interesting story that's serious all the time. That's why most stories have a comic relief to give you a break from the monotony and recharge you for the next serious segment. Over here, it's not as if there's no comic relief, but even when someone's trying to be lighthearted, it comes off as something quite serious.
The god you unleashed is called Uru. It is his army of the dead that has been laying waste to Dawn, the source of all your suffering.
And how is it that you know all of this?
Because I am a god too.
You! Tiny talking fox thing. You're a god.
There are lesser and greater gods.
Now let's talk a bit about the visuals and performance of the game. The visuals are a mixed bag for sure. The game starts off with a dark map that looks quite dull, reflecting the war going on in the background. But once you keep going, you eventually reach a map where things take a much brighter approach. And the final arena for the last boss was actually quite spectacular, which I don't want to spoil here. So yes, the visuals are all over the place. As for the performance, I've seen a few people on the PC complain about inconsistent frame rates and a few glitches. I played on the Series X using performance mode, and I have to say it didn't really feel like I was getting a smooth 60 frames per second throughout the game. But it wasn't a deal breaker at any point.
No, she's not accepting anyone.
Just pretend I shoved you, alright?
Sound and music. Let me start with the voiceovers. I felt the voice actors did a good job for the script that they were given. No real memorable performances here, but again, I feel that's because the story itself is a bit weak. The sounds and music of the game are pretty forgettable too. A few complaints have been raised for the sound mixing, which is a bit off right now, meaning you can't really tell where the enemies are coming from, but things like this can be fixed through a patch, so I assume that's not a long-term issue. Seeing how little I had to say about the other aspects of this game, you can guess that it is the gameplay which makes Flintlock worth a recommendation. Like I said in the beginning, this is a perfect 7 out of 10 game. A game which is not necessarily bad, but which doesn't really thrill you because you've seen almost everything of what it has to offer in other games. This is the second game from developer A44 Games, whose first title, Ashen, was also a Souls-inspired title and got decent reviews. Flintlock is certainly a huge improvement in all aspects over Ashen, except perhaps the story. Now, the studio needs to decide whether they want to keep working in this genre and try their luck at a breakout hit, or if they want to try something else. Either way, I will be eager to try their next title for sure, because this team does seem to be quite promising. Thanks for watching.